You're listening to Bigfoot Society, and I'm Jeremiah Byron. Tonight's account is from two physicians that are also amateur Bigfoot researchers. You'll hear about how they went deep into the California wilderness, what they found there, and also what happened when they went up to eastern Washington. What happened there wasn't just weird, as you'll soon hear. This is a story of Curtis and David, the doctors who came back believers, so stay with us. All right, Bigfoot Society, you've got the privilege of talking to Curtis and David today. They are both physicians and also both friends, and they've come on the show to share some interesting Bigfoot-related experiences they've had in the last few years. So, gentlemen, welcome to the show. How's it going today?
Going great. Thanks for having us, Jeremiah.
Nice to meet you. Good to talk to you, Jeremiah.
Absolutely. And just so that our listeners can associate the different voices, Curtis, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great.
Perfect. And David, yourself?
Doing good.
Awesome. Very, very good. Very good. Well, guys, we were just talking a little bit beforehand, and it sounds like you have actually kind of prepared a way to present this. So, you know, what I feel might be good is I'm going to hand it over to you guys. You can present your experiences, and then maybe we'll chat a bit about it, and I might have some questions for you afterwards.
Perfect. Thanks. So I'm Curtis again, for those out there, and just a quick little introduction. David and I have been friends since, I was trying to think the other day, I think he was 8 and I was 10. We're now both in our early 60s, so we've been friends for over 50 years. Probably during the summers between when I was 10 and 18, we probably spent every day together at each other's houses. We went on vacations with each other's families. I think David considered my mom his second mom, and I considered his mom my second mom. So we're kind of brothers/friends and have been so for so long. Once we became doctors and had young families, we kind of drifted apart, partly because our work schedule, family schedule, and I lived in a different state. But we, get back together every few years, and we were the kind of friends that, we might not have seen each other for a couple of years, but when we got back together, it was like no time had we been apart. In the last few years, our careers have kind of stabilized. We were both established. Our kids have grown up. And we started maybe 10 years ago getting back together every year or so to go on a guy's trip. And so our friendship has rekindled and gotten even better over the last 10 years or so.
Yeah, we've been best friends since we were, so young and stuff, and always considered. We were roommates in college. We actually went to the same medical school together, and I always considered him, my best friend through life. So it's been great. And so when Curtis, I called him up one time and said, "Hey, let's get together and let's go do something."
And so I knew David had an interest in Bigfoot. He, growing up, he was very interested in Native American lore, probably read a book a week on Native American history. And I knew he had an interest in Bigfoot. I probably did not have much of an interest in Bigfoot. And then, of course, finding Bigfoot came out, and that made me even much more of a skeptic. But about 3.5 years ago, my wife and I had the opportunity to go to Nepal, and we were hiking towards Everest Base Camp, and our guide was a Buddhist monk. And he asked us if we wanted to go see a Buddhist ceremony, and just to, show interest in the local culture. We said yes, and we went to this ceremony, and it was, obviously we didn't understand a single word, but it was still very amazing. And afterwards we were drinking tea, and he asked us if we wanted to see something special, and he took us over to the back of the temple, and there was a box that kind of looked like about the size of a fire extinguisher box that you might inset in the wall or something. and it was about that big, kind of just hanging on a big pole, and it was locked up. And he unlocked the case and opened it up, and there was a skull and a hand of a Yeti. And he gave us a little bit of the background, and by his story, the Yeti had helped the original Buddhist monk there like 300 or 400 years ago to build that temple. And then when the Yeti died, they took his bones and kept it inside the temple. And the skull was probably maybe 50% bigger than a human skull. It still had a scalp on it, still had some short brown hair about an inch long. And then the hand is what really caught my attention. I'm an orthopedic surgeon, so I know hand anatomy pretty well. And the hand looked just like a human hand. It did not look like an ape's hand, but it was about twice as big as the typical human hand. I couldn't touch this. It was behind glass, but I was looking at it from 6 inches away. And so my interest suddenly peaked. And when David called in January of 2022 and said, what are we going to do for our guys trip this year? I said, why don't we go see if we can find Bigfoot? So that's kind of how we got started.
Yeah, my interest in Bigfoot, been, a little more Curtis's, but like I said, I was Native American history was what I was interested. I was the Indian when you played Cowboys and Indians, read a lot of history with that. I knew that Native Americans had different names for Bigfoot, like Sasquatch, hairy man, wild man, or great brother. I had seen pictures of their cave markings and things that they've done. I saw the Patterson-Gimlin film, or, saw the shows like, most everyone else, Finding Bigfoot, now Bigfoot Expedition, and things like that. I had heard of Teddy Roosevelt's story that he had written in his book before he was president, of the trappers, one of them that got killed in the camp, by a Bigfoot, and they'd found footprints and things like that back in the 1800s. So it's always been out there for me. And so when Curtis came over for my 50th birthday, he had found a bunch of Bigfoot stuff on my DVR, and really didn't. That's when we first realized we both had a little interest, with that. So we said, well, let's go find Bigfoot. And in 22, I said, well, I'll start doing some research on it. And I went to the BFRO and found, looking over California, after we start local. I mean, we were definitely rookies, but most of this was just hey, we're going to get together with my best friend, and we're going to go backpacking and camping and spend some time together. But in the meantime, we'll say, hey, we're going to go look for Bigfoot. So BFRO, I looked up in the Siskiyou, Siskiyou area, which is up in the northwest California, same area where Bluff Creek was, Willow Creek and all that, and with the history of all that, and with it showing the most, A-type sightings in California, I said, hey, let's go up there. And I started looking on, mapping and trails and, interesting areas. And I always wanted to find, places with, with water and out as far away from everybody as we could. And so I found this on the Smith River. It's called a Kelsey Trail. And I said, hey, that's where we're going to go. So that's how we decided on the first spot. And so we go driving out there, and it's probably 25 miles east of Crescent City, and then you go 6 miles out on a dirt road and end up at the trailhead. And then you backpack in about 6 miles to where we ended up at our base camp at that time.
And around the base camp, we spent the first 3 or 4 days hiking all around. We went up and down. We had camped right by this creek. We went up and down the creek. We went clear to the Smith River, went off trail, and all sorts of places, and didn't really find a whole lot. And then David had been looking about our 3rd or 4th day at his maps, and he realized that even though there was only one way in and one way out on this South Kelsey Trail, that a branch of it had crossed the creek, and we hadn't been up that way. And so he suggested, since we hadn't really found much in the first 3 or 4 days, and we weren't unhappy by any means. I mean, like David said, this was called a Bigfoot finding trip, but really we fully expected just to go backpacking and, camping with our best buddy. But anyway, he found a branch of the trail had crossed the creek, and so we decided to do that about, like I said, our fourth or fifth day, and that's when we started finding some interesting things.
Yeah, the trail was heading more into the wilderness area from where our base camp is. And when we first got there, like you said, there's only one trail in. So we set up game cameras, on the trail we knew who was coming in or what was coming in there. So the whole time we were there, we only met one guy. Came in on one day. We talked to him. He was coming in. We met him when he was coming in for one night, and we talked to him when he went out. So we knew when he was there. And we knew when he left. But we went up, so we crossed this creek. We're hiking probably 2 more miles into the wilderness direction, and we're trying to be really observant, real quiet. We're listening, smelling, walking, looking for things. And we start finding things on that other side. Right when the first thing Curtis found this 12-foot high big branch that was broken and bent down towards the trail at 90 degrees. And I got a picture of that, and he's trying to reach up, and it's really high. And that's strange. Well, how did that happen? Well, there's nothing on the ground that fell on it or broken. The branches above it are intact, and the branches below it are intact. He was kind of like, well, what broke that? We don't know. Could have been anything, but we couldn't give an answer to that for what we were finding in the area. So we keep going on, and we found probably the strangest thing I found was that this tall, big tree. It was probably about, I don't know, 5 inches diameter, Kurt, would you say? And it was pointed,
5 or 6 inches diameter, yeah.
But it was probably 30 or 40 feet long, and it's pointed uphill. But the bottom of it was about 5 feet in the air, wrapped. It was wrapped with these other trees, and they were twisted around it and holding it up in the air about 5 feet off the ground. And we look around, and we're looking for stumps, and where the heck did this thing come from, and how's it being suspended in the air about 5 feet, and how would that happen naturally? But it was definitely we have a picture of the branches being wrapped around it and holding it up in the air. We couldn't figure out where it came from. We couldn't figure out the stump. We knew it was pointed up there. There was a game trail going right by it. So that was really strange when we first found that one.
Yeah, and the wrapping did not look like a vine had grown around the tree. It looked, you could tell that the vine or branches were twisted to hold the tree up. And, a 30-foot tree that's 5 or 6 inches in diameter, it probably weighs 200 pounds or more. Could a human have done that? Sure, but it was just sort of our first, besides any tree breaks, our first, unusual finding. And we kind of went deeper into the forest, and this was all off the trail. So we took that trail, like David said, about 2 miles from our base camp, but then we went off onto a game trail and started finding these things. I think the next thing we found 2 trees, probably, 50 yards apart, that had branches laid up against them. And these branches were not from the tree itself. You could tell one of them was from a manzanita bush or something. It was completely red, and the tree was, nothing like that. And they were just leaning up against a tree, kind of like a lean-to, and they weren't really big enough to have anything sleep under it, but it was just kind of a weird finding. And sort of even before going on this trip and since, we've seen other people who've shown videos of that, and I think it's even been in Expedition Bigfoot. So we found a couple of trees with leaning branches, and then our next finding, there's probably about 100 yards away from that, and again, we're off trail in the middle of the wilderness. We came upon this dwelling, this primitive shelter that looked just like an igloo. It was probably 5 feet tall, 4 feet tall, about 6 to 8 feet wide, maybe 8 feet long, kind of about the size of a 3-person backpacking tent. And it had an opening at one end, and none of the branches had been cut by a saw or an axe. and they were all woven together. So this, definitely took hands to make. They weren't just leaning against something like a lean-to. They were woven to give strength and stability. So we started thinking, our first thought was, as doctors, we always like to rule things in and rule things out. Our first thought was, someone's been staying here, some person. But then we started looking for signs of humans being there. We looked inside, and there was no bedroll or anything. Whatever had slept there, had slept right on the twigs and branches and pine needles right on the ground. You could see a depression in there. And then we started looking for a fire pit, because most humans, when they're camping, are going to have a fire pit, if not for heat, at least for comfort, something to watch at night, companionship, whatever. And there was no fire pit. And then I think David came up with the idea, hey, there's got to be trash around here somewhere. And we started looking, because even the cleanest humans are going to leave some evidence that they were there. And there were no wrappers or twine or plastic or pop tops or anything. There was no trash whatsoever. And then we kind of expanded our search, and we probably got 40 or 50 feet away, and we saw sort of circumferential around the whole dwelling 6 or 8 piles of scat. And these piles of scat looked, it was shaped like human scat would be, but it was probably twice the diameter and probably 2 to 3 times the volume that a human would make. And these were placed all around the camp, maybe every 30 or 40 feet. And at first we thought it was just sort of random, but someone has, since suggested to us that maybe whatever lived there was using it as a boundary marker. And I don't know, do you know who Beans Baxter is in Alaska? I don't know if you know him.
Yeah, absolutely.
He happened to hear about our story, and he sent me a video of some scat he found in Alaska, and it looked exactly like that. And he thinks that scat is from an Alaskan Bigfoot. The other interesting thing about the scat is that there was no toilet paper and no moss, no leaves. Nothing was used to clean whatever did the scat. So here we find this dwelling, this igloo-like permanent, primitive shelter with scat all around it, with no other signs of humans have ever been there. So, that was just a crazy finding that we found.
On our way out, so yeah, we spent quite a bit of time there with that one. So on our way out, another thing we found was the wallet, and I've seen, a lot of these things you don't, like you say, we're rookies at it, but we see these things and we've never heard of those things being happened in other Bigfoot, information or videos or whatever. But then once we start seeing these things, then we start seeing other, hey, we saw that. That's what, that's what it was when we saw. In other words, this horizontal suspended tree that, it was a horizontal tree that was weaved in a tree. And it was perfectly horizontal, and it was like probably, would you say, Kurt, 20 feet long? Just perfectly weaved between these branches. I go, how does something naturally get that perfectly weaved between these three and just fall on, in there like that? And we couldn't figure it out. You got to picture this thing out there.
So that was a second tree that was off the ground.
Yeah.
All in the same side of the creek. So.
And I saw another one. I saw another video since then. I saw it, but it was a bigger tree that was horizontal like that. And I go, that almost looks exactly like our tree, just bigger. So that was interesting. But as we're walking, out, from there, we noticed, I've always been interested in tracking and things like that. And I read a lot of Tom Brown Jr.'s books and learned on tracking, and part of the observation of nature was looking through things and looking at the open spaces between things. And so I try to do that. And I noticed this area of wetness about 30 yards off the trail as we were heading out. And I told Curtis, I said, I'm always looking for track traps and things like that. And I go, hey, there's some wet over there. Let's go over there and see what we can see. And they're expecting like tracks of something, either deer or whatever's in the area doing it. So we go, but it's about 30 years. There's bushes in between us, and we have to work our way through it. We get over there. And there's probably it wasn't like a river or a creek or anything going. There was just this wetness of area, probably about 40 by 15 feet or something, like a pool size area of marsh. They had water in it. I think it was about, probably only 3 or 4 inches deep in there. And you get over there and you don't have to walk through it. I mean, you go 10 feet to the left and we actually walked around it to get to the other side, or you go 10 feet to the other side and walk on dry land. And we get over there and we walk around and we look in there, and here we find 3 footprint or steps of tracks of something walking. There's 3 of them. There's the first one right at the edge, or the second one like about, a foot or 2 later. And then the third one is like, it's literally 4 feet further in steps into right in the middle of the marshy area. And then there was not another one leaving. It was about 4 feet out. So whatever had walked on there had made 2 initial steps, and then a big step, and then another step out. And we were pretty amazed at that. We're going, hey, these are actual footprints. We took pictures compared to ours. We were, again, rookies and didn't bring a measuring tape, but we compared our foot size to that. And it was about twice the width of, Curtis's foot. And we both wear size 13s. And so our shoes are about 13 inches, and it's about 3 inches longer. So it was pretty close to an estimate, about 16 inches, long, and about 6 inches wider. So is what we thought. But the interesting thing is, we're trying to say, okay, did someone come walking through there? And I'm like, why would a human being walk through here when you can go 10 feet to the right? Why would you get your boots all dirty like that? And we're trying to say, well, how can you make a step that's 4 feet and, a 4-foot step strike? And I go, there's no slippage. Someone's not running, because if you run and step in mud, there's gonna be some slippage or stuff. It was just like normal, just steps in there. And the crazy thing was about that is we went back, because now we're really interested, and we're, saying, hey, we found something here, and we went back the next day to go look at it again. And that third one in the middle of the marsh had disappeared. And it was gone. I took a picture of it. Well, that's interesting. So what that tells me was that whatever had walked there within 24 hours of the time that we had been there. Otherwise, that step would have been gone. So fairly recently that it would have done. So that was pretty exciting for us.
Yeah, so something with 16-inch feet, and David and I, like he said, our shoes are 13 inches. Took 3 steps to get across a 15-foot marsh. And like David said, the one that was in the water was gone the next day. So we went back there the next day to look at that. We found that, and we kind of just sat and listened for a long time just to see what we could hear. And we really didn't hear much, but something caught my eye just across from the marsh on the other side of the trail, probably 4 feet off the trail. 4 feet or 5 feet off the trail. And it was right under the canopy of a big redwood tree. And it looked like a broken tree. And so I started thinking, well, while we're just listening, I wondered, is this a tree break that could be a sign as to where to cross the trail? My mind's kind of thinking all sorts of things. But then I was looking at it closer from afar, and it didn't widen out at the base like a tree would. So I then remembered some videos where people have shown things with sticks or logs or even trees being upturned and jammed into the ground. So once we were done listening, I decided to walk over to this thing and see if it was a tree. And the other thing that caught my attention when we'd been just sitting there listening was it was under the canopy of a redwood tree, and not much grows under the canopy of a redwood tree because there's no light, the pine needles, all that stuff. And so I walked over to this thing and looked at it, and it did look like a big stick that had been jammed into the ground. It was probably 4 or 5 inches in diameter and sticking up about 3 or 3.5 foot. And the part that was sticking out was clearly broken. And so I started looking up into the redwood tree, and clearly it did not come from the redwood tree because it was not the same type of tree. And then we looked at other trees to see if there was a branch that had broken or a tree stump that this could be a source of, and there was nothing around it. So it really looked like something that had been jammed into the ground. And so I started wiggling it, and sure enough, I was able to pull it out, and both ends were sharp, and so something had caused this big limb or branch or even tree to break in 2 different places, and then jammed one of it clear into the ground. And, if a human had done that, they would have had to have done it when it was muddy. Or the other way we could have done it is to pound on one end with a mallet or something. And the end that was sticking out of the ground was sharp. Nothing had pounded on it. So here, right across from where David had found these 3 steps, and then the 4th step would have been onto the trail, was this log, if you would, that had been jammed into the ground. And so that was kind of another little crazy finding. That was sort of our last full day there. We went back to camp. The night was pretty quiet. The next morning we had to get up and start heading home. So we both woke up about 6 a.m. because we had about a 3.5 hour hike out, and then had a 10 or 12 hour drive to get back home. And we woke up at 6, and I kind of went to our little area we had set up to cook food in under the canopy of a different redwood tree, and I wanted to start some coffee. So I poured some water into a pot, and all of a sudden a pine cone lands by one of my feet. Well, I didn't think much of it because I'm under a redwood tree. So I filled the water and put it on the little camp stove and lit the fire. And as soon as I lit the fire, another pine cone landed by my other foot. And David is standing probably 10 feet away from me, still under the tree. And we both kind of look up thinking, well, that's, coincidence. Two pine cones fall and almost hit me after, within 5-10 seconds of each other. Well, we still didn't see anything. None of the branches were moving. We couldn't see a squirrel. There was no wind. And so I went over and sat in my little camp chair, which was probably 10 feet away from that, just to let the water boil. And as soon as I sat down, 2 more pine cones landed by my feet. So, I look up, and David is standing in the same place he had been, and he looks up and can't really see much, so he backs out from under the tree just to get a better look.
Well, and the first 2, I didn't think anything of it. But then when the other 2 almost hit him sitting in his chair, I was like, what the heck's going on? So I backed out about 20 feet to get out from underneath the canopy. I was trying to look up in the tree, and I was out in open air. There was nothing above me. And I'm looking up, and all of a sudden, a pine cone lands by my foot. And then another pine cone lands by my foot. And then another one. And so and the crazy thing about these was that it was like, this was all within a minute of time. It was not like spread out over time with it. As soon as those started hitting by my foot, both of us stood up at the same, I was already standing, but we both turned and looked up a ridge. Our camp was surrounded on 2 sides by water, and there was a trail that came in from the side that we would walk in, and we could see down there. But both of us stood up and at the same time turned and looked up this ridge that was behind our camp, almost like we were feeling that that's where it was coming from. We didn't see anything like coming down there. As soon as we turned and looked, it stopped. We didn't get any more pine cones over there. We started looking at those things, and about 3 of them were green pine cones. And I was like, how the heck does green pine cones fall out of a tree? I mean, I think someone had to pull those off, in order for that to happen, because it was dead silent. There was no wind or anything. I'm looking around for squirrels. I had seen a squirrel about 50 feet down the trail in a tree, but nothing up in the tree that was above Curtis from where he was. And so at that point, we were like, okay, someone is throwing pine cones at us, and we're trying to figure it out what's going on. We're 6 miles. It's 6:30 in the morning, and for someone to walk in 6 miles, they'd have to get up at, start at 2, at 2 in the morning to get there to throw pine cones and then leave. But we had game cameras around the entrance to our camp, and nothing was on it. So we started, that was kind of a strange, really strange event for us and stuff. And we were thinking, who's throwing that? But we pack up. We were leaving that day anyway. We pack up and we start hiking out. We don't see anyone until we get about 4 miles back towards our truck. And we ran into someone at that point, but they were not camping. They were hiking in at that point, and they were scouting to try to look for a place for the next following weekend that they were coming up. But there was no one else around there. And so we really had no answer, as something had to be pulling green pine cones off of trees and throwing it at us.
And so this was our California experience in 2022. We never saw Bigfoot. We never heard Bigfoot, but we had a lot of strange experiences that, as physicians, like I said, David and I, every day, what we do is we listen to people, we look at data, we form a conclusion and form a treatment plan based on that. We don't have any explanation for most of these things, being from a human source. So although we didn't see Bigfoot or hear any vocalizations, and again, we made a rookie mistake. We didn't take any recorders this time. So when we were asleep, we really don't know what happened, but we were in the middle of nowhere. When we were in the wilderness, we were 8 miles from the trailhead. And like David said, we had trail cams up on the trails. No one else except that one guy had come in during the whole week, and he left the next day. And then those 2 people we met hiking out had never even gotten back to where we were. So as to the best of our knowledge, there were no other people in the forest for most of that week.
This is some really interesting stuff. I think it might be good to take a few minutes to chat about this one, just so
Sure.
that people are able to remember it before we head on to the next one. There's some questions that I have. So the area where it looked like something was laying down, did you get an idea for how long that area might have been on the ground?
So David, looked at the scat, and he's studied tracking. He estimated that the scat was probably 1 to 2 weeks old based on how it looked. It was drying out. It wasn't wet. It also wasn't crumbly. So, there was definitely an impression on the ground that something had been there. I guess by having 6 or 8 piles of scat around, they had been there for more than one night, whatever was living there. So, David's estimation on how old the scat was probably 1 to 2 weeks. So we think that something had been staying there, as no longer than a week or 2 before. And definitely there was an indentation there. So I couldn't tell you how long something had slept there, but with 6 or 8 piles of scat, if it's coming, it looked like one animal was inside that igloo. I guess there could have been 2, but it looked like one indentation in the ground. So however long it takes something to make 6 or 8 piles of scat, I guess.
Gotcha. And maybe to ask it a different way as well, would you say that by the size of that indentation, it looked like there could have been something that was maybe, if it was laying down, maybe like 6 feet tall or 8 feet tall or anything like that from when you looked at it?
Yeah, I would say at least 6 feet tall and probably longer, I would say the length of the thing was 8 to 10 feet with an opening at the one end. And and the thing took up most of the, front to back area. So I would say somewhere between 6 and 8 feet. Is that what you would say, David? Give or take?
Yeah, I think in that, in that range. And definitely it was, weeds, non-cut branches that would make the thing.
The other thing, we'll talk when we get to Washington, we can talk about what makes a 16-inch footprint, but a 16-inch footprint in a human would essentially be about 7 feet tall in a human. So that sort of gives you an idea. David's 6'4", and his foot's 11.5 inches long. So if something had a 16-inch footprint, it was probably at least, if you use human measurements, at least 7 feet tall.
Okay. David, do you remember, let's say talking about the scat, were you able to see anything in it, like evidence of what it may have eaten, whatever it was that left it there?
I didn't see, I'm looking for berries and things like that. I didn't see any of that. And everything seemed pretty digested. I didn't see hair, in there. I know the kind of the bigger things I was looking for, with that.
And interesting enough, I had spoken about Beans Baxter. The video he sent me, they couldn't really tell what that animal had eaten either. So yeah, we couldn't find specifically what it had eaten, but I tell you, it was huge. It was, if you put all of your fingers together and looked at the tips, that was probably half the diameter of how big this scat was. It was probably 2 or 3 inches in diameter. And like I said, probably 2 to 3 times as long as what a human would typically make.
And I don't think that we had talked about this. Was it laid out in a certain, was it in a straight line or in a pile or anything like that?
Each one was kind of in a pile.
Okay.
Almost like, not to get gross, but like a soft serve ice cream, kind of coiled a little bit, and then some more straight, but it was kind of in a pile. And and it was weird. The person that talked to us about being a mark, a boundary marker, that probably makes more sense just by how uniform they were around the
distance,
around the structure. Yeah. At first I thought it was just random that whatever had woken up in the middle of the night and had to go, or in the morning and had to go, just decided to go right or left. But someone talked about the boundary marker, and that makes more sense because they were probably all, 30 or 40 feet apart. So, if you just took from the center of the igloo and drew a circle, they were all sort of right on that 40-foot or so boundary of that circle.
Huh. That's extremely interesting. It sounded like there were, or I guess I'll ask it this way. What was the sound like in the area of that, that structure, and were the regular sounds of the forest, or what did you guys experience in that way?
I didn't hear much of anything in that area. It didn't seem any different than the other places that we were walking, though, as far as, I don't recall saying, hey, I'm not hearing any birds or anything like that. So it didn't seem that structure area didn't seem anything different than some of the other areas that we were walking to me.
That next day, as I said, we kind of went out there and listened. David actually had some sound amplification headphones, and we both had them on, and we were listening. You could hear forest sounds. We couldn't really tell the direction because with those sound amplification headphones, they just amplify the sound. It's not like your regular ear where you know this is off to your right or left. But we did hear some things moving in the forest. We just couldn't tell how close or bipedal or a deer. So there was some movement around. But like David said, I agree with him. When we were around that structure, I don't remember hearing birds or anything.
Different, let's say an individual has a way of leaving a trackway or a set of tracks. Humans leave their tracks a certain way, or rabbit leaves tracks a certain way. Was there anything that you noticed about when you found these tracks where they laid out in a certain way?
It was in a line, but they weren't. The first track I'd say was, so wherever you put that first footprint down, the next one was slightly to the right of it.
Okay.
And then the next one was in line. If I was to do a line between all the tracks, it was definitely heading across, just directly across this marsh area in a straight line. But they were not like, where one putting a footprint right in front of the other or not. It was slightly, I can look in the picture, probably, let me say a foot to the right.
Yeah.
The right foot was foot to the right of the left foot on that one. And then the next one was straight in line with the left foot.
Yeah, and it looked bipedal. It looked, like David said, left, right, left. It did not look like a double step of a four-legged animal like a bear. I mean, bear would probably be the only other alternative. But then again, not a lot of bears have a 4-foot step length either. And it didn't look like, if this was going to be a bear, it would have had to have double stepped perfectly 3 different times. It really looked the shape of a human foot. In other words, the heel was not quite as wide as the 4-foot. And it definitely looked to us, at least, as being bipedal.
Gotcha. What was the month again you guys were up there in California?
It was the last week of August.
Okay, so that takes the whole, it was not a bear just coming out of hibernation that was leaving those scat piles in August.
No. And we were trying to, when we decided when to go, I was like, I want to go before hunting season starts.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why we normally chose that time.
Gotcha. Last question about the California trip. Was there at any point where you felt anything out of the ordinary physically, anything affected you in any way when you were in that area?
No, I didn't. I never felt anything like that. And I never smelled anything like bad odors or anything like that.
And I would say the same. I didn't really feel anything. People have asked us, when the pine cones were coming, did we have a weird feeling? And David's description of us both turning and looking up, I think we quickly processed again the information to decide that the only place it could have been coming from was the ridge. It wasn't like we felt an uneasy feeling that something was, on the ridge behind us looking at us. We just quickly processed. We were surrounded on a couple of sides by a creek. The trail was on the other side. There was the only place those pine cones could have come from if they didn't fall out of the tree above us. And, clearly with David 20 feet away, they couldn't have fallen out of a tree. We just quickly felt that, after processing that information, that's where they had to come from. And, coincidence or not, as soon as we both looked up the ridge, and this was a ridge that was probably 40 feet tall right behind our camp. As soon as we looked up, the pine cones stopped. So that was either coincidence or something didn't want us seeing them throw pine cones at us.
That's one of those, that whole experience, I think, I'm trying to put myself in your guys' shoes, and it would be just enough that I would be like, yeah, got to go out again, which you guys did go out again eventually, but that's just weird enough, yeah, it's pretty awesome.
And we get kidded by our family, we didn't see Bigfoot and all this other stuff. And they're right, we didn't, but I don't know how to explain a lot of what went on. And like you said, after that, but going up there, like I said, my background with Bigfoot was finding Bigfoot, and other than exposing Bigfoot theory to many people, not a lot of people have good things to say about finding Bigfoot. So I was a skeptic, and after this, I now was at least open to the idea that Bigfoot, if not being a possibility, was a probability.
Yeah, and I was higher than Curtis to start. I was in the probability phase with that. And then I think both of us, when we got out of there, we were saying, hey, this is definitely probable, if not, you're sure something's going on there with that.
Gotcha. So it moved the needle a little bit for you guys.
It did.
Probably a lot. We talked about it continually for the next 2 years. And in 2023, we actually went looking for gold in Idaho. And if it wasn't for that, we probably would have gone bigfooting in 2023. But even there, we may have found a print. So even though we went looking for gold, we might have found some evidence of a Bigfoot in Idaho. But we got to about January of 2024, and David calls me up and says, we need to go on another trip. So we kind of had a discussion. Do we want to go back to the same place? I mean, that's, it was a great place, and there's something to habituation. Maybe going back, we would see more, but we wanted to kind of go, after watching videos, we wanted to kind of go somewhere else. So we started discussing, well, maybe we'll go to Canada, with all the findings they have around Nordic, but, it's hard to get guns up there, and we wanted protection. We weren't hunting, but we didn't want to go out in the wilderness with, bear around and no guns. So that kind of ruled out Canada. And then we thought about Alaska, but, getting to Alaska is just so hard. It would take up half of our vacation just getting there and half of it getting back. So we started looking in Oregon and Washington, and I went to the BFRO like David had for California, and found that Washington had more sightings, Class A and Class B sightings, than any other state in the U.S. I think at the time it had 876 or something like that. I don't remember the exact number, but there are a lot of Class A and Class B sightings. So we kind of decided to go to Washington because that's, close to Canada, obviously. And like David had said about California, we wanted to just get away. So we went where the population wasn't. There are a lot of reports on the western half of Washington, because that's also where the most population is, Mount Rainier and the Cascades and, the Olympics and all that stuff. But we wanted to get away from Seattle. So we started looking on the eastern side of Washington. And I actually found 4 or 5 YouTubers who have had experiences in eastern Washington. And then I found 3 of those specifically had a lot of activity near Sullivan Lake, which is about as far north and as far east you can go in Washington without either going into Canada or Idaho. And there's this campground along Sullivan Creek, which feeds into Sullivan Lake, and it has over about 10 miles, about 18 campsites. But they always, when you look on reservations, they look pretty full, and we didn't really want to be around other people. So I called the ranger station there and kind of spoke to one of the rangers and asked him where we could do dispersed camping, kind of away from everybody else, but still have water source, and even have a bathroom if we needed it. And he suggested a place called Gypsy Meadows. So we quickly looked it up on Google Maps, and when you look at the satellite view, it's probably maybe 12 miles up the creek or so from Sullivan Lake. And while there are a few campgrounds maybe a mile or so away, there's not a whole lot. And in fact, just across the creek, which sort of goes on the edge of Gypsy Meadows, is the Salmo-Priest wilderness. So while we weren't in the wilderness, we were maybe 100 yards from it. And at the end of the Sullivan Creek Road, maybe 3 or 4 miles up from Gypsy Meadows, the road ended in the wilderness. And we went hiking up there one day and just saw how remote it was. So basically, after finding a bunch of people on YouTube, that's where we decided to go.
So Gypsy Meadows, so we go riding coming into Gypsy Meadows there, and like I say, it's about 12-mile dirt road. You go up there. We really got, most of the camps were not occupied at the time we were going. We passed, occasional once or twice. There was about a quarter mile just before Gypsy Meadows. We passed one trailer. The guy was there. He was in that trailer the whole time that we were there. And we go into the meadow, and it was empty at that point. So we went all the way to the end of the meadow, as far away as we could get from the main road, and set up our camp at this, a pretty nice campsite there. And we got there around 3 in the afternoon, and plenty of time to set up camp. And then something happened to Curtis right then that made more sense later, but we didn't think much of it right then. But go ahead.
Yeah, so we were setting up our camp, and we put up our awning for a place to eat, and then we both were setting up our tents. And after we set up our tents, I decided to blow up my air mattress while it was still light, so I didn't have to do it when we went to bed. And I had this little backpacking air pump that probably blow up my mattress in about a minute or so. The only problem with it makes a pretty high-pitched whine when you turn the motor on while it's blowing the air. And so I turned this motor on, and all of a sudden from across the creek, we estimate maybe a quarter mile away, so it was from the wilderness, we heard this owl start hooting. And at first we thought, well, that's a little strange, because it's during the day, but the barred owl has been known to hoot during the day. So we really didn't think much of it, but it would not stop hooting until I turned off my pump. And as soon as I did, the hooting stopped. And we only mentioned this, it did catch our attention, but it seemed like what strangeness that followed was almost always preceded by owl hoots. So we're not saying that wasn't an owl that was hooting at us, but later on in the next few days, owl hooting sort of preceded everything else.
So once we got set up, we'd heard that. Again, we didn't think anything of it. Hey, it's cool to hear an owl, But at the end of the meadow, there's a trail that goes out toward the northeast area. We decided to go for a hike. We had a couple hours left of sunlight. So we go walking out there, and we cross a creek over, and we're following a game trail. And we left the main trail and, to get across this creek. And we're walking along, and actually I see a footprint. And I call Curtis, hey, look at this. And there just is one indentation. I mean, it wasn't like perfectly clear or anything, but you could definitely see the heel and the wider, foot. And we measured it, because now we're less rookies and we bring measuring tapes. But it measured about 14 and a half inches long with that. And I feel, well, that's cool. So I decided, we ought to cast this thing, because we never casted anything before, as we are reviewing. But I said, it's not a very, great print, but hey, we need some experience in casting. So we went back the next day to cast that, and decided to leave some, gifts, apples we brought, and peanut butter jar we put out, for there. And we put a game camera up on that area, and just for observation. We never did see anything. No one ever took any of the gifts, but we did go back and cast that one print at that time.
And while we were there, it was, again, essentially the same week as in 2022, as the last week of August. For whatever reason, there was a burn ban. So we couldn't have campfires, which was kind of disappointing. But our second night there, some other campers had come into the other side of the meadow, and they were probably about 120 yards from us, and they were camped right up against the west side of the meadow, and we were sort of on the, I guess you'd call it southeast side of the meadow, and they were about 120 yards from us. They came in kind of around dusk, and the first rule of Bigfooting is when you get there, put out recorders. And of course, even though we weren't rookies, we still made a mistake. We didn't put out recorders that night. And because there was a burn ban about 9:30 or 10, it started getting cold. And, we sat around looking with our FLIRs all around. And we'd even gone for a night drive to see if we could pick anything up on David's dash cam or on our FLIRs, and we saw deer and bear and all sorts of things. But finally, around 9:30 or 10, we decided to go to bed. And just as we turned out the lights, that same owl, or at least from the same direction, kind of gave us a good night hoot. I didn't think much of it again. I mean, this is kind of neat hearing the owl. For whatever reason, that night, I just could not get to sleep. The first night from travel, I fell right asleep. But this night, like I said, we went to bed about 9:30, and I kind of tossed and turned for a couple of hours. And finally, I looked at my watch, and it said, 10 to 12, and I still hadn't fallen asleep. So I kind of closed my eyes, rolled over, and tried to get to sleep again. And about 10 or 15 minutes later, so probably just after midnight, that same owl started hooting. But this time, it didn't stop. It was almost like I had that air pump on, for 3 or 4 minutes. It just kept hooting and hooting and hooting. It would pause after 4 or 5 hoots and listen, and then pick it up again. And as I'm laying there, I'm kind of getting annoyed at this owl because I'm trying to sleep. I started thinking, it's getting louder. Is it getting closer? Does an owl hoot when it flies? I don't know. But it seemed like it was getting closer. And not to put human characteristics on an animal, it seemed a little more frantic. Besides being louder, the hoots got quicker. And like I said, after 4 or 5 hoots, it would kind of stop and listen. And then I again had to kind of pause and make sure I was hearing what I was hearing. The hoots, I thought, turned into whoops. And it was distinctly different, even though it seemed to be the same voice. And after 4 or 5 hoots, I'm about ready to get out of my sleeping bag and go wake up David. All of a sudden, there's a response off to our north and off to our east. Something answered these hoots and whoops, and they answered them with hoots. So as soon as the answer came back, the owl, if you would, stopped hooting. And so I didn't really have a chance to get out of bed and wake up David, and I wasn't going to wake him up for nothing. So I tried to get back to sleep, and about an hour later, I was still not asleep, and the exact same pattern happened. This owl started hooting again, and then for the second time, I started hearing whoops, and this time I kind of thought to myself, well, I guess I really did hear him. And again, just as I'm about ready to get out of bed and wake up David, those 2 owls off to the north and off to the east answered it. And as soon as they answered it, it was silent again. So again, I didn't wake up David. The next thing I know, I had most likely fallen asleep, and David was shaking my tent, getting me up.
Well, it was probably around 2 o'clock, between 1:30 and 2 o'clock. All of a sudden I get woken up by this tremendously loud, hooting, and it was from where my tent was. These 2 campers, there was a younger boy and an older, he probably, I'd guess the older guy probably in his late 20s, and the younger guy was probably in a teenager. And they had just come in and parked on the opposite end of the meadow from where we were, more closer to the entrance on the road there. But they were parked on the and their tent was like right on the edge of the forest, where on that side of the meadow. And I swear this thing, the noise and the racket that I started hearing, this like hooting, started from the, if I'm talking about a degree from me, at about 45 degrees to my right towards the creek area. And it was loud, and it was the whoa, 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 whoa. It was moving, and it was going fast. I felt that it was going right through those guys' camp. And all of a sudden, in the middle is whoa, whoa, whoa. All of a sudden, I started hearing this rah, rah, blah, 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 blah. And the only thing it sounded to me, if you've heard the Sierra sounds in that samurai gibberish, are like, oh, blah, blah, blah. But these guys were like, they were like angry at each other, and they were going, rah, 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 rah. But it was moving as this is going along, and then it keeps moving probably from that 45 to the directly right by those guys' camp. I said, that's going right through their camp. And then it continued on across the road and up to the main road and up the ridge. And it was only about 30, probably 30 seconds of time for that motion to happen across there. And I got up and went out and got Curtis, like, hey, did you hear that? What the heck was that? And he comes climbing out of the tent, and we have our flashlights out, and we look down the meadow, and these other guys are climbing out of their tent. And what's going on? We didn't go talk to them that time of night, but it was definitely a loud screaming. And the only thing I could picture that rah, 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 rah noise was compared to the Sierra sounds with it. And Curtis hadn't heard it, but I tried to explain it to him, and he got up the next morning and actually went and talked to one of those guys.
Yeah. And so just to put this in perspective, the creek is the border of the wilderness, and likely what David's describing is whatever pack was moving came from the wilderness, crossed the creek, went behind these guys' camp, through the woods, across the road into the meadow, across another little small meadow, up a ridge that was essentially forest, about 100 more yards, and across the main road and back into another wilderness. So it probably traveled, 150 yards at least in seconds. And it was all essentially cross country. And this was, I looked it up later. Of course, there was a burn ban, so nobody had a fire. There was no light from the fire. And it was also a waning moon that was less than a quarter of a moon. So there was no moonlight. So whatever traveled this 150 or so yards across the creek from the wilderness did so essentially in pitch black. But David's right. The next morning, we all crawled back into bed. Maybe by 2:30 or so, we'd all been looking around for 10 or 15 minutes. I didn't sleep very well after that. I just kept waking up thinking I heard something and didn't really hear anything. But pretty soon I see light coming into my tent, and I say, I'm not sleeping, I'm just getting up. And I decide to walk down to the bathroom. So it's probably, maybe an eighth of a mile away from our camp. And when I get down there, I see someone is in the bathroom, and I didn't know who it was. So I kind of waited about 50 feet away. I didn't want to bother them while they were going to the bathroom. And when the door opened, I realized it was the older of the two gentlemen that had pulled into camp that evening. And so I kind of wanted to get a sense of what he had heard, because clearly they heard something. They were out at 2:00 in the morning looking with flashlights all through the meadow and through the forest to see if they could find anything. But I didn't want to influence what he said. So I said, boy, that was a crazy night, wasn't it? And he said, yeah, it was. What do you think that was? And I said, I don't know. I kind of wanted to get his opinion. And he said, there was a pack of them, and whatever they were barking while they were running. And one of them was up in the tree, or might have been up in the tree right above my tent. And then they ran and, behind your camp and up the ridge and crossed the road. And then it became silent. So I said to him, so you think they were dogs because you said they were barking? And he said, well, Not really. That's the only description I could think of. It just sounded like a dog barking, a bunch of dogs barking at each other. And I said, well, can you imitate it? And so he kind of thought for a second, and he imitated the samurai sounds to me. And so then I said to him, well, have you ever heard of the Sierra sounds? And he said, no. And I said, what do you think of Bigfoot? And he kind of had a nervous chuckle, didn't even say anything else, and kind of turned and walked away. And incidentally, they left right after breakfast. I don't know if that was their plan. It might have been, or I don't know if they were influenced by what they heard, but after breakfast, they were gone. But now it's like 6:15 in the morning. I went to the bathroom. I figured David was still asleep because when I left the camp, he was asleep. Both David and this guy said it had crossed the main road, sort of 100 yards or so behind our camp. So I decided I was in my camp shoes, which are basically like Crocs. I wasn't going to be able to do any cross country stuff, but I figured I could walk up the dirt road at least. And I walked up about 150 yards. And I noticed up this ridge, all the grass had been churned up by something. I couldn't really see any big footprints, but something definitely had churned up the grass going up this ridge. And then I looked to my right, and about 10 feet away, there was a tree break about 9 feet up. Both David and this young man said that it had crossed the road, so I figured it had to come out on the other side somewhere. So I walked across the road towards our camp, and our camp was still at least 100 yards away, and I'm looking into the forest. I can't really see anything because, that is saying you can't see the forest because of the trees. All I see are a bunch of trees, but I eventually found a trail coming out of the forest up the embankment to the road, and I marked the trail. And then I decided to walk back to camp. And when I got back just into the meadow, David was awake, and he was kind of looking around to see if he could track anything from the other side, from our campsite.
So yeah, I got up and Curtis wasn't around, so I started, walking. I want to walk down to those guys' area and see if I could find any tracks or prints or things like that. And there's a small meadow across from where their camp was. It goes into the forest towards the road. And I was in there looking, and I could see, some imprints, nothing specific, nothing like hey, this is a great footprint or anything like that, but definitely a game trail. So when Curtis got back, we got our gears, got our stuff together and decided to go follow this game trail. We're following along, and he goes across small, hills and things, and we start following it up, and we end up coming up on this little ridge, and we see this perfect X of it, two trees making an X, and it's just sitting right in front of us, and the trees are, it's probably about 20 feet tall, Kurt.
Yeah, and probably 10 inches in diameter at the bottom or so.
Yeah, but it's a perfect X, and we start examining these trees, and the one, if we're standing looking back towards the meadow, the one on the right was bent down, and it was put in between two different trees that were close together, and that kind of was folding, and it went on up. We could see where it was. It had broken at the root base, but it was sitting right there, but it had been pushed, and I don't know how it would fall so perfectly to go in between these things. There was no branches on the tree that was cleaned off. Then we looked at the other crossbar and on the other side, and this one was actually, we got pictures of it. It was not broken at the base, but it was twisted, and you could see the bark was rotated and twisted in order for it to fit over this other one, and then to fit in between the other two trees that it went through. And I was like, how does that happen? How do you twist a tree to fit it, naturally, they're like, no way that's going to happen naturally. And then, so we're done looking at that, and we're like, this is we've seen other, YouTube things on people, their X's and things like that. And they go, this is not a natural X. And we got pictures of all that and then videos showing the twisting of that one tree. How does this not break? Because it had to be a green tree for it to do that. So then we keep following the game trail, and either not coincidentally or coincidentally, we end up walking out on the road right by Curtis's mark that he had marked on the road. And so it was like we had actually followed the track or the trails up into that area. You never saw any like real good footprints that we could, there was definitely disturbances in the dirt, but nothing we could, look and say, hey, there's a big footprint or anything like that at that point.
And then we also looked later sort of behind that guy's camp. When I talked to the guy, David had originally thought that it ran right through their camp, but I had talked to him and he had said, no, it ran through the woods right behind their camp, the whole pack. And he said there was more than one of them. And I think David believes he heard 3 different voices. So we believe there were at least 3 of them, but we found 2 game trails that went right behind their camp and ended basically at the creek. So something, like I said, came from the wilderness, crossed the creek, ran behind these guys' camp. And, whether one was in a tree above his tent or not, I don't know, but that's what he said. I guess the other alternative, if something is very tall, it might sound like it's in a tree above your tent. But their tent was right on the edge of the forest. So I suppose it is possible that there was one of these animals in the tree above it. But that day, not much happened. We went for some hikes. Finally, the 3rd night, we get smart enough to put out recorders. We didn't record any of that stuff from the night before. But like I said, most nights we went on a little drive. And before we went on this drive this night, I went and put a recorder out on the Gypsy Meadows entrance sign, and it was essentially right in line with where these things had passed. And I turned on the recorder, and then we went for a drive. Now, I've gone back and listened to all that, and while we were gone, you could hear some twigs breaking in the forest and something walking on the gravel. Now, that doesn't mean it couldn't have been the guy who was, in the trailer a quarter mile from us, but I've gone back and listened to it, and at least for that hour or so while we were driving, we heard something walking around the recorder. And then about an hour after that, I heard 4 rock clacks. It was 2 clacks, stopped for about 2 seconds, and then 2 more clacks. And I thought, well, that's kind of strange. And then I kept listening. And about 10 seconds after those rock clacks, you hear David's truck driving into the meadow. So, again, putting human characteristics on an animal, did it see our headlights coming from, a half mile away? Did it hear our engine? Did it then clack to give a warning? I don't know, but it was either very much coincidental or it really did happen. So we got back from our drive, and again, we can't have a fire, so we went to bed pretty early. And about 11:30, again, I hear that same owl hooting across the creek again. And this time it stopped after, 10 or 12 hoots. And then about 5 minutes after that, I heard a couple of footsteps on the ridge up above us. Now, the twig breaking and footsteps up above my tent were probably, 75 feet away or so. And it was going pretty slowly. In other words, I wouldn't hear constant walking, so I couldn't tell if it was bipedal or a bear. But maybe 10 minutes after that, something was right outside David's tent.
So we had just started setting up our recorders, and I put up, a recorder out on a pole. But I put my phone, and I said, I want to start recording things if I can. So my phone was ready to start recording and things inside my tent. And all of a sudden I get woken up by this hooting right, is literally 10 feet away from it. Like there's a pole over there in the meadow. I was behind this, bush of the trees, where my tent was, but it was only 10 feet away from this pole. And it was right by that pole. It was like standing there, and it was loud, and it was like, whoa, 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 it sounded like a barred owl hoot, but then it goes off, into like we said, it's a little different. But I was like, what do I do now? So I started recording, and I'm like, do I get out now? Do I turn on my light? Well, I don't want to scare this thing off. I don't know what it is. I from by this time with all the hooting and things, and with especially what I heard the night before with those Sierra sounds, I was like, oh, well, what do I do here? So then it started moving. It moved across and was further away. It was like across the meadow and was doing the same thing. And I didn't hear any like walking or anything like that, but I didn't hear any, we'd heard an owl start flying before, but it had, we'd heard the wing flaps at that time, but I didn't hear anything like that on this time, but it was loud and it kept going. And then we started hearing some responses farther away with that. And so I was like, this thing is right outside my tent, whatever it is. And if this is a Bigfoot, I don't know if I should start getting out of my tent or whatever. I mean, I was armed and things like that, but it's like, what do you do in that situation?
And it, like David said, it was extremely loud. People talk about they feel a percussion in their chest or something. I don't know if I felt that, but this thing was one of the loudest things I've ever heard, and it sounded like it was on the ground. Again, I guess it doesn't mean it couldn't have been an owl, but it didn't. It sounded like something imitating an owl. And my recorder was about 100 yards away, and I've listened to it, and on my recorder, it is extremely loud from 100 yards away. It is just crazy how loud it is. And David's looked at it on a spectrum analysis, and he'll talk about that in a second. But, we get out and look around again. We don't find anything. We kind of go back to bed. But I've since listened to that night on all my recordings. And during the night, once we were eventually asleep, after probably 1 or 2 a.m., there were 2 distant howls, like the Ohio howls, separated by probably 15 minutes. So there was one howl and then another. We heard 4 or 5 different whistles on my tape for that night. And then there was also a metal banging, almost like something hitting sheet metal. And I've done a little bit of research on YouTube, and I found a couple of other people who were in the same campground who have heard that. And they were trying to figure out what it was. And literally just the other day, I started thinking, I wonder if it's a road sign or something that something is hitting, because, there are signs on the main road, saying turn here for Gypsy Meadows, or there's a sharp corner or speed limit or whatever. But there's a metallic bang that I hear at like 3 a.m. On my recorder. And anyway, we didn't hear any of that because we were asleep. But David has done a spectrum analysis on that guy, that whatever it was on the ground. It wasn't in the air or it wasn't in a tree. Something was on the ground low, making these noises. And he's done a spectrum analysis and compared it to barred owls.
So, I had took it from my iPhone recorder and put it on a, Audacity and put on the spectrum analysis. And I downloaded 3 or 4 different barred owl sounds, from the internet, and tried to compare that to what it was. And they were different. They didn't look, really anything, like it. So I didn't, I'm not a sound expert or anything like that. But when I was trying to compare it to known barred owl sounds, it was different, from where it was. But I don't know what could be something that loud. It was very loud and really close. And didn't want to get out of the tent at that.
And since then, I've sent a message to is it Chris Spencer from the Olympic Project? I could be getting the name wrong.
Yeah, probably Chris Spencer, David Ellis.
Yeah, it was Chris Spencer. I didn't send him the recording, but I did ask him if he has any experience or anything of them mimicking owls, and he replied to me he's heard them mimic just about everything, but he's never heard of them mimicking owls, and so I didn't send it to him. But I've since on YouTube heard 2 or 3 other people talk about something that didn't quite sound like an owl, and they're associating it with Bigfoot activity. So, thinking about that, as I said, David and I like to analyze everything, sometimes maybe way too much. I mean, I think there are basically, 3 options. Maybe it was all owls, and maybe we're wrong. I mean, that's option 1. Option 2 is, at some point, a Bigfoot was mimicking an owl. The third option, because David heard whoops, I heard whoops, 2 different nights I heard whoops. The third option is, maybe Bigfoot is using those owl hoots to try to mask their whoops. But, even if we're completely wrong, then we're wrong. And, if option 1 is true, that it was all owls, then we're wrong. But I can't imagine everything, especially that doesn't explain the Sierra sounds that David found. But if either they were mimicking owls or they used owls to mask their own whoops, that still shows, pretty good intelligence to be able to do that. But anyway, the next morning we got up and we both walked down to the bathroom, and there was this little road going into Gypsy Meadows. It's probably, I don't know, what would you say, David? 10 feet wide, 8 feet wide, something like that. It's not a 2-lane road. It's a 1-lane road, basically.
Yeah, 1 lane. Maybe
10 feet wide or something.
Yeah.
But anyway, we're walking down and we look down, and in the tracks that David's 1-ton truck had made, all of a sudden we see this 18 by 6, so 18 inches long and 6 inches wide wet spot that looked like a foot. And there was only one of them. So if this was a real print, and we think it was, it basically took 1 step onto the road and was gone. And it was probably a little more than halfway across, maybe 2/3 of the way across the road. And then we started looking around, and the creek was only maybe 100 to 150 yards away. And then I think David noticed that right where it had crossed the main road, there was another tree break. And this tree break was fairly fresh in that the upper part, the leaves were just starting to turn yellow, but they still had green needles on them. And the needles below were completely green. So we're not saying that the tree break occurred at the same time as this print, but something left a wet 18-inch footprint on that road.
The break on the green tree, at one time it had been green, and so like you said, the leaves on the above the break were yellow, so they had been dying for a little while. But the break was up about 9 feet tall. And there again, we're looking around to see how's that break? Did something fall on this, whatever? And there's not. It's like something that held up there and actually had to hold it and break it in order for it to bend. And it was pointed towards the road again, like the other one we had seen back in 22, pointing towards the trail. So that was pretty strange, for that.
Yeah.
But I got a picture of that wet footprint next to my shoe, and it definitely is big.
Yeah. And that afternoon, we found a trail across the road. It was a regular hiking trail. We took it up, and probably about 1.5 to 2 miles up the trail, just off the trail, there was some grass that was maybe 2.5, 3 feet tall. And David noticed that there was a bedding area for probably 3 or 4 deer. It wasn't they weren't big. I'm not implying that, anything bigger than a deer was there. And we thought, oh, that's kind of neat. But what we had missed going out, we found on the way back that afternoon, about 50 feet from those 3 or 4 little deer beds in this grass, something with 2 feet had stood in the grass about 50 feet away and had apparently been, looking at these deer while they were sleeping. David actually found both the deer beds and the other print, and both of them were just like 5 feet off the trail. But something had either stood or perhaps squatted, and you could definitely see, about 18-inch impression in the grass where something had stood with one foot, maybe 6 inches away from the other foot, and it was looking in the direction of those deer. So that was kind of crazy too.
It was standing right by a tree, and just two different footprints, just smashing the grass down. You could definitely see that. So the next thing that happened was, the next day we were just relaxing in midday in our hammocks. And by this time we're thinking, okay, are these hoots mimicking or not? And so we were starting to wonder what that is. So then mid-afternoon, we're just resting in our hammocks. And all of a sudden we hear just probably about 30 feet away up on the ridge behind our camp, we hear this hoot, and we look at each other and go, that is close. So we grabbed our gear, and I grabbed my camera, grabbed our gear, and started heading up the ridge behind our camp, thinking we're going to see something and find something. And it's close. And I turned my camera on. I'm trying to, we're not running. We're walking slow. We're trying to catch something and then follow this. And we start following this trail, and we see these big prints in the side of this ridge, and we have pictures of these big prints. They're all about 16 inches long, and we're following this up this ridge when we go. And as we're going along, all of a sudden, off in the other direction from where we had seen the X direction across the road, on the other side of the road, we hear these 3 distinct whoops. Not hoots. They were dang whoop, whoop, whoop. And I turn to Curtis and I go, we're not moving. We're going where we're going, because I'm not getting distracted and pulled in a different direction, because this thing is this direction from where we were going. And he agreed, and we kept going. And not too long after that, my battery died. It was like, what the heck? This is a fully charged battery, and it's going out, within, just a few minutes of the time that we're up here videotaping. And I hadn't grabbed an extra battery. I didn't think it was going to die because it had been fully charged. But who knows why that happens, with that. But on the way back, I had noticed a wet area, on the way back. So I kept that in my mind before we were gone. And I don't know if you had anything to say on that perspective, but we had started walking through some other areas.
Yeah, so we also found a teepee structure when we were following those hoots up the ridge. It was probably 5 branches that came together at a point, probably 20 feet tall. So here behind our camp, there was an X, maybe 100 yards directly by our camp, and then off more towards I guess it would be north, maybe 150 yards from that X, we found a teepee structure. But we didn't really find much the next day. And David's actually looked at his video of that little marsh that he saw, and there was nothing in the marsh that evening. The next morning was our last full day there. We both got up and decided to walk down to the bathroom about 7 a.m. And David went into the bathroom, and I didn't want to just stand there while he was going to the bathroom. So I decided to walk out to the road, and I kind of walked past that guy's trailer that we talked about, who had been there the whole time we were there. And when I walked by, he was inside his trailer. And in the 4 or 5 days we had been there, we had seen him pretty much every day and waved at him, said hi. And he was walking his dog in the meadow. He'd say hi to us. We really didn't talk to him, but we were were cordial with him and he was cordial with us. So I kind of walked down the main road and cut back through the campground, and he was the only one in this dispersed camp area, and he'd been there the whole week. And when I came back up, maybe 2 minutes later, he was outside looking around his trailer, and instead of saying hi, this time he goes, "Where's your buddy? What's he wearing?" And I'm thinking to myself, I'm a guy, I don't know what my buddy is wearing. But I said, "Why?" He goes, "Well, was he dressed in tan from head to toe?" And I said, "No, I don't think so. And he's still in the bathroom. What's going on?" And he said, "Well, I heard you guys walking down to the bathroom, and I saw you walk up to the road, and I sat down in my chair, and about 10 seconds after you walked up to the road, my dog is at the door barking and scratching and trying to get out, and he wouldn't follow any commands, and he never does that. And so after about 15 seconds of him scratching at his door, the guy got up and looked. He said he was expecting to see one of us in his camp, which we would have never done. We're not going to walk into somebody's camp at 7 a.m. But anyway, that's what he expected, and that's why he asked what David was wearing. And he said from the creek to the road, he saw something big and tan from head to toe walk that whole distance. Now, the thing you have to realize is this is still a forested area, so it's kind of like you might see it for a second and then not see it for 3 or 4 seconds, and then see a glimpse of it again, and then not see it, and then another glimpse, and in 10 seconds it was across the road. So he saw something big and tan walk from the wilderness area across the creek and up to the road. And David gets out of the bathroom, and we all look around, didn't really find anything at the time. And so we started talking to the guy, and he said, "I've been here the whole week like you guys have, and I've heard some really strange things. I've heard sounds at night," and he basically verified the samurai chatter from the couple nights before. He didn't really hear the chatter, but whatever had made the noise woke him up the same time that David heard the chatter. He said he's heard wood knocks. He heard a tree get knocked over. And then he looked at David and I, and he said, "I think I just saw Bigfoot." And, there was no one else in the campground. David and I were the only other humans. I was down the road maybe 100 yards, and David was in the bathroom, and something came out of the wilderness, walked between his trailer and the bathroom, and walked up the road. So that was pretty interesting. And then that late afternoon, David had an idea, thinking back to what we had done in California, and it was sort of our last thing in Washington that we checked out.
So I remember that when I noted that wet area when we were going up with my camera on that ridge, and I told Curtis, "I don't want to leave without going and checking this out. It's a trap or a track trap, and I want to go check it out, or else I'm going to always wonder." So we went back up there, and we're walking along and looking, and we come around the corner, and here are 2 footprints in the mud that I go, "Wow, look at that." And we go over there and we measure them, and they're 16.5 inches long, and the stride was 48 to 52 inches, for the next step. And I go, "This is amazing." And they're wide. We definitely see some toes on there, but it was in the wetness. It wasn't like deep water or anything, but they were definitely visible, and we got pictures of those. And then we look around and we start saying, "Okay, where'd they come from?" And we started looking back, and where it got actually more wet, and there was actually water in this kind of creeky type marsh area. We could see all the water was covered with pine needles that had fallen on the water. It was just still water. And you could see these areas of steps where there was no pine needles. And we followed it back, and they were all about the same, distance of stride. And we kept following it back, and we went about 100 yards further in that direction, and we found by a tree, kind of on the uphill slant, we found this, again, a 16.5-inch footprint with toes and stuff. It was on a hill, so weren't able to cast that. And we weren't able to cast the ones in the mud because of how wet it was, but we took pictures, measured it, and stuff. Interesting, later, like Curtis said, I went back to my video recorder, and we had walked by that area the day before when we were chasing that hoot, and I couldn't see those footprints in that same, swamp the day before. So in retrospect, it was interesting that we're showing that something had walked up that night, through that wet area.
And, we talked earlier, what makes a 16.5-inch foot? I was a math major in college, so numbers just intrigue me. And a 16.5-inch foot, which is what David found in a human, equates essentially to a 7-foot tall person. Shaquille O'Neal's foot is 16.5 inches, and he wears a size 22 shoe. And to put that in perspective, how many people are 7 feet tall? And it's basically one person per 250,000 people. So it's pretty rare. And then I knew that in orthopedics, which is my specialty, we have gait analysis studies. And so I went to the formula used to kind of match step length to height. And David had measured 48 to 52 inches between these 4 steps through that marsh. And just using the lowest number, if you equate that to a human stride is usually about 33, 34 inches for a 6-foot tall person. To have a 48-inch stride, you have to be 9 feet 6 inches tall if you're a human. And then, to put that in perspective, I then said, well, is there even a 9-foot tall person alive? And the tallest person in known written history was like 8 feet 10 inches. So there's never, in at least recent history, been anybody 9 feet tall or bigger. So although we never again saw Bigfoot on this trip or anything like that, and like David had said about California, we never smelled anything. David heard samurai sounds, and we found extra large footprints with toes that equate to a giant if they were a human. So the chances of it being human are infinitesimal, really. So I think we're both in the camp now that Bigfoot was there in Washington when we were there.
Guys, this is a wild account. I mean, are you guys planning on maybe going back there someday? If this was me, I would be already like, okay, I'm going back to this area. Or maybe if you don't want to, it did get a little intense.
Saturday. We're going Saturday.
We're leaving Saturday.
This Saturday?
Yeah.
And
we're packing up.
It's a different time of the year, but we're going Saturday. And then we're also planning on going back again at the end of August in case there's some kind of migrational thing and we don't find anything in next week. So yes, we're definitely going back to Washington at least 2 more times.
Oh, wow. Is this still going to be the 2 of you, or are any plans? Are there any local researchers to that area? I'm trying to think.
So yeah, there are. The one that we talked about, that we'd watched his videos, he's going to meet up with us there. His name is Will Ulmer. And then Jonathan and Sarah Brown heard our story, and Jonathan called me. He actually called me when I was in Antarctica, believe it or not. I was on a cruise ship down in Antarctica, and he woke me up at like 2 a.m. And he said, hey, are you guys available in June to go up again? So we're meeting Jonathan and Sarah Brown and this Will Ulmer in June. Now, when we go back in August, we're just planning on going, the 2 of us.
Yeah, our wives are going with us this time. They wanted to go up on this trip, so we're taking them as bait.
You laugh, but I mean, we all know that.
Yeah, they like women.
Yeah, when the female side is introduced, some really weird things can happen, right? I mean,
Definitely.
Yeah, so this next week there'll be at least Sarah Brown and then our two wives. So hopefully that will attract something.
wow. So the Browns, so good. I would assume they're going to be documenting that as well.
They plan on it. They want to see. Jonathan heard about our story, and I talked to him on the phone for an hour or so, and he wants to go see all these things like the X. I mean, the X should still be there. It's just, what are we, 8 months ago? The X should still be there. You should be able to see the twisted bottom of the tree, and obviously the footprints won't be there, but they can at least see the area. And then Will Ulmer is one of the local guys, and he's going to be there. He's had a lot of experience more down in the campground area. I don't believe he is actually camped up in Gypsy Meadows, but he said he wanted to join us and see if we can find anything.
That's awesome. It'd be great to see. I'm a big fan of their Salish Sasquatch channel. They do a great job.
Yeah.
So it'll be cool to see what they are able to document. But also the other guy is that the Grassman 58 channel?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. That's I was like, that sounds really familiar. I was looking through the pictures you sent while you guys were talking, and that picture of the X is it's incredible. Just the way that it's really woven. And if you guys are cool that can I put that in the version? Yeah.
Yeah, you can post anything you want. They'll send you. I think I sent you all the pictures of the prints and all that too. So
it's amazing. It's a perfectly symmetrical X.
Yeah.
And both branches are wedged in between two standing trees that are only about 6 feet apart, those two trees. And the space they're wedged in is probably only a foot. And then, like David said, the one tree, its root ball had been pushed up, but the other tree is twisted at the base. So, you think, could the one fall that way? Sure. But I don't know, unless there was a tornado, how the other tree would twist. And of course, if there was a tornado, the other trees around would be gone too. So, I mean, it is an amazing X structure. There's no doubt.
It's probably one of the best ones that I've seen. Like, it is so good that I'm like, man, is this like is this a screen cap from like the Todd Standing documentary? Like, it looked that good. And I was like, look through the metadata of the photo. I was like, oh, it's right there. Like, I looked up when you take a photo with an iPhone, it captures the metadata, and you can look up the the location on it. And I was like, oh, it's right where they're saying it is.
And like David said, it's probably only 100 yards behind where our tents were. And the crazy thing is, it's probably 30 more yards to the road or 40 more yards. From the road, I couldn't see it. Like I said, I was looking in from the road when I marked the trail. And from a camp, you can't see it. You only see it when you get maybe, I don't know, what would you say, 20 yards from it, David, maybe, or 30 yards from it?
Yeah, I mean, while we're walking up, we didn't sit till we got, we're coming up a hill when we're working that. But if you're coming in from the road, you wouldn't get it until you get inside the tree line.
Right.
Absolutely incredible. The hooting, weird sounds that you were hearing, at any point, did it sound like, you would hear the hoot, and then at the end of it, would it sound like it was something that was messing it up, or didn't really know how to finish the sound, or like it didn't do the normal owl sound correct at the end? Was there anything like that at all?
That's what I interpreted it as, okay. It had been mimic. Again, I messaged Chris Spencer. He he hasn't heard of anything mimicking owls, and I respect his work, immensely. Sarah and Jonathan have the recording, and they said that they would send it to Chris. I don't know if he's looked at it or listened to it, but it sounded to me like at first something was pretty well mimicking the owl. But then, like I said, I'm sort of putting human characteristics on this sound. After a couple of minutes, it was getting louder and the hoots became quicker. And as they became quicker, they sort of degraded into a whoop. So, I guess it's almost as if it couldn't keep up the perfect mimicking if it was mimicking an owl, and then resorted to, we've all heard whoops being described or heard recordings of whoops. So that's sort of how I interpret it. Obviously, my interpretation could be wrong. The other option, like I said, is if the owl was making most of that first, minute and a half, 2 minutes of that hooting, maybe the whoop was only to come at the end of the hooting to sort of mix in and kind of confuse anything else. I mean, I look at those as the two options, and either way, whether it is mimicking and then just degrades after a couple of minutes, or whether it just adds it on, that takes intelligence to do, either way.
And I just don't know how you could go from the owl hooting to, the owl, la, 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 and then back to hooting as you're moving across the forest.
So even if my other explanations, and even if Chris Spencer is correct that he hasn't heard owls being mimicked, that still doesn't explain the Sierra sounds that David definitely heard, and the other camper heard as he verified the next morning.
Exactly, and I think that's a great way to put that, because it is a unique account where you have the other campers, and then you have the gentleman in the trailer that had the visual as well. It's a really, really cool account. I can't wait to see, what happens when you guys go back. It's very cool.
Yeah, we can't either.
Man, that's a wild drive for you, though, isn't it?
Oh, tell me about it.
Yeah. So I had to fly from Phoenix to Sacramento, and then it's like a 14-hour drive from there, David, or something like that.
Yeah, we'll drive up probably halfway, stay somewhere, and then finish it off.
But like you said, with what we've, no putting down what we found in California, we definitely have the fever after what we found in Washington, and it's worth the drive up there.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and I definitely understand that. Neither of you had the visual, but you're just extremely, extremely close. It gets you. I totally get it, and so I would assume that you guys are both. The needle probably moved away after that last account. What would you say?
I don't think the needle can move much farther.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm a math nerd, and in my mind, I've done the probability of having a 7-foot tall or greater person running 150 yards through the forest at night in the dark, barefoot, in a light rain, across terrain, and traveling that distance in 20 or so seconds. I've done the math, and it is infinitesimal. Literally, it's greater than 1 in 50 million chance that could have been a human that ran across that guy's camp that night. I know that sounds crazy, but I'm a numbers guy. I think in numbers, and it is just almost impossible for any of that to have been a human. And what other animal can speak, samurai chatter?
Stuff.
So we're pretty convinced now. You're right.
Absolutely. Is it a thing where are you prepared to potentially have a sighting when you go back in just a few days, potentially?
That's an interesting question. So let's talk encouraged about that. So I've been thinking, people always ask me, what are you going to do when you see one or meet one type thing? And one of the things that just hit me over the last month or two is, just to go back to my interest in the Indians and stuff, is like, I would like to try to communicate if possible, with these things. And I'm trying to figure out how to do that. And my one thought came up is, if these guys have been around for so long and around Indian tribes, and they've all, other Indians tribes used to actually trade with them, or, they felt that they were the keepers of the forest. They kept, they were like another tribe of people out there. And I believe these are intelligent beings. And I think they're as intelligent as we are. They're a lot more knowledgeable of nature than we are. But my thought came is, how about Native American Sign Language? And maybe that was passed on in their generation, if they were possible. I think they've observed people and they can pick up on things and stuff. But it was an interesting thought for me that the Native American Sign Language might be something that would be passed down their generations and stuff. So I've been trying to learn some of that in case, that was, one of my things and stuff. So I'm trying to prepare for that, for if that happens. It's all going to be on how aggressive they are or how willing they're doing. But I've been trying to learn some of that information in case something like that happens.
And when David brought that up to me last week, that idea popped into his head. I started looking up the native tribes that were in the area in Northeast Washington, and the Colville Indians were there. And so I tried to look up if they had a spoken language, and I've looked up the word for peace and the word for friend. So we have those two words that we have in spoken language, and David's been learning sign language. And then it'll be interesting to have, Jonathan Brown there, who, lives on an Indian reservation, and see what his thoughts are regarding that.
The sign language thing has actually come up in a few interviews that I've done, thinking specifically of the chat I had with Ernie from Western Massachusetts, where there was some sign language involved with that one. Also, there's at least one gentleman I've talked to off record where that is a part of it, where sign language seems to be effective. So I would say you're probably on the right track there, David. Is there a resource that you found where, you're looking up?
There's a tutor thing. I got 2 different books on it. They weren't doing exactly what I was liking. I found a YouTube channel that's been more helpful for me, and where they have an old Native American talking to somebody, and he's using his hands and explaining the language, because there's more to it than just learning certain things. It's the expressions and how you do it with it. So I've been kind of going through that, trying to, that's been more helpful for me, going and looking at that old guy talking with his hands, and he speaks and he talks at the same time. So that's been interesting.
That's awesome. And I think, just from talking to you guys for a little bit, it sounds, what I'm getting is you guys definitely have the right, intention and the right motivation in all this. And I don't know how you guys feel about all that, but I have found from talking to hundreds of people and also being in the field with a few different people that definitely does play into it, is how the person is when they go into the field and why they're there, and do they have a positive intent or negative intent that plays into it. So I think you guys are on the right trail there as well, unless I'm totally off base with that, but I don't think I am.
No, I think we kind of went into it at the beginning with curiosity, and now we're even more curious, even though we've learned a lot, and we definitely want to know. We think we know. We're pretty sure we know, but we want to know. And obviously, we're not there to hunt. We're not there to do anything. We just at first sort of did this as a fluke, but now we're hooked, basically.
And I appreciate your input on that, because I hadn't heard anything about like Indian Sign Language, but it's good to know that that just makes me want to continue that process, because I hadn't heard about that before. But
Well, David and Curtis, it's been just a really fun chat with you guys. I want to make sure that you were able to share everything that you had wanted to share on the show tonight.
I think the only other thing, one other time, and this is just a small finding, we were hiking in the wilderness across the creek, and we're literally in the middle of nowhere, and there are no human trails around. And we came across this about 5-foot stump of this big, huge tree. And on top of this tree stump was a fresh mushroom.
So I forgot about that thing. The mushroom it's like almost head high. And I look at it and I'm going, what is that doing? It's laying sideways. And I was thinking, well, maybe it's growing out there. And I went over and it picked it up, and it was not. It was set there on top of this stump in that particular place. And it was a fresh mushroom. It wasn't dried up. It was like brand new fresh mushroom. It could have been growing there, but it was not. It was not attached. So something had placed this mushroom in the middle of the wilderness that we were hiking on top of this stump.
And if we're to believe that night that David heard them travel from across the wilderness, or across the creek from the wilderness up to that other ridge, that is the direction they came from. So that was the only other thing that we saw or heard that we didn't really talk about. So thanks for letting us add that at the end here.
Absolutely. I would say definitely keep in touch, guys. It'll be interesting to see what happens, in just a few days, but also later on in the summer. And I hope some really cool stuff happens. Maybe you guys get freaked out a little bit, maybe not too much, but I hope it all goes well for you. So that'd be cool.
Even if it doesn't, I'll be camping with my buddy. So that's what counts.
There you go.
But we have bait right now.
We got the wives. So
there you go. Well, thank you both for coming on the show tonight. I appreciate you coming on, Curtis, David.
All right. Thank you, Jeremiah.
Hi, my name is Phyllis Barnett. I'm 61 years old. It's been about 17 years, I think. I was going through Oregon. I was visiting family, and I was heading home, and it was a little after 8 a.m. in the morning. And I stopped to look at the view coming out of Orville. And I think it was Orville. I know I was not too far from Trinidad. And I saw 2 Bigfoots coming out of the water. One was down in the water and turned and looked at me, and the other one stood up and turned and looked at me and started walking towards me. It was about 10 feet from me or so, and I got a real good look at it, and it scared the shit out of me, and I didn't know what I was looking at. I remembered seeing photos of Bigfoot and stuff, and it looked like a Bigfoot, and no doubt. And I had nightmares for weeks after that. He must have been about 8-9 feet tall. He was humongous. Like I said, I wasn't too far away from him. I now live in Washington in Pierce County, and my son was out hiking and took some video, and we're pretty sure he found a Bigfoot nest over by Mount Rainier. We live about 20, 30 miles from Mount Rainier now. And I'm hoping to see one again. But it did scare me to death, and I ran to my car and left. I had a camera, but I was so scared I just left. Thank you for listening. Bye.
If you'd like to share a voicemail to be potentially featured on the show as well, head over to BigfootSocietyPodcast.com and hit the Share Your Encounter button. Just wanted to take a minute to say thank you for listening to this episode of the Bigfoot Society podcast. Curtis and David's story isn't just compelling because they're physicians. It's compelling because of what they saw and what they still can't explain. From that eerie shelter hidden deep in the forest to the pine cones thrown in silence, it's the kind of story that sticks with you. And if you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to the channel on YouTube, hit the bell icon so you don't miss future episodes, and share this one with a friend who's into Bigfoot, the wilderness, mysteries, or just a story that makes your skin crawl. So if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, make sure you're following us there. And if you could leave us a positive 5-star review, it really helps the show continue to grow. And hey, if you or someone you know has had a Bigfoot encounter, especially in places like Siskiyou, Crescent City, Sullivan Lake, or even deep in the redwoods, I'd love to hear about it. You can email me at bigfootsociety@gmail.com. Don't forget, Sasquatch Summerfest is happening very soon, July 11th through the 12th at Green Waters Park in Oak Ridge, Oregon. I'll be talking to people about their Bigfoot encounters. You're welcome to say hi and to share your encounter face-to-face with me. Bigfoot Society listeners can grab a 2-day pass for the price of 1-day admission with code BFS at checkout. Tickets are available now at www.sasquatchsummerfest.com. So thanks again for being part of the Bigfoot Society. Until next time, keep your eyes open, trust your gut, and never stop asking what else might be out there. And see you in the woods.